I see far too often beginner photographers seeing photos they like online and asking the photographer what settings they used, as well as some photography Facebook groups making it a condition that you share your settings when you post the photo. In this TechCorner video, I'm going to explain why knowing someone's settings is absolutely useless and in most cases will confuse more than help. When you first start learning photography and you see amazing photos online, you might be tempted to ask the photographer what settings they used so you can try and replicate that look. The issue is that unless you are standing next to that photographer when the photo was taken, knowing the settings is absolutely useless. So let's take a step back for a minute. Your camera settings serve two purposes. One is exposure and the other is the aesthetic look of the image. Whenever you take a photo, there is a fine balance between exposure and aesthetics, and sometimes you need to sacrifice one for the other. Exposure should be fairly straightforward. You adjust your ISO, shutter, and aperture based on the lighting conditions at the time the photo was taken. This means that if you were to take a photo outdoors in the same spot at the same time each day for 5 days in a row, your exposure settings will be very different every day. This is because one day you will have full sun, another day might be overcast, maybe on day 3 there's a light cloud cover and the sun is behind the clouds. The point is that getting the same photo 2 days in a row will most likely require slightly different settings. So what chances do you have when you're in a different town to the photographer and you don't even know the time of day the photo was taken? Then there is your camera and lens. Digital camera manufacturers use slightly different techniques for measuring the camera's ISO settings, which you can learn more about in my What is ISO video linked in the description below. In addition, different lenses have slightly different light transmission properties, so two different lenses at the same aperture setting will also have slight variations in terms of exposure unless you're using cinematic t-stop lenses. But if you are, I doubt you're watching this video. So hopefully you can see so far that using your own settings with different equipment on different days will give you slightly different results. So expecting to get the same results as someone else shooting at a completely different location at a different time of day with their settings expecting to get the same look will leave you disappointed. So what happens if you're shooting in a studio setting where weather and the sun has no effect on exposure? This actually complicates everything further because as you introduce flash, not only do different manufacturers vary the light output, but the inverse square law, which you can learn all about right here, come into effect with distance from light to subject, making it near impossible to just use someone else's settings to replicate the photo. This is why it is so important that you understand how the exposure triangle works, and I will leave a link in the description below explaining it. Understanding the exposure triangle and the inverse square law will allow you to look at a photo and be able to adapt your location and equipment to match, usually without knowing the settings used in the original photo. So what about if you're wanting the settings because you like the aesthetic look of the image? Again, if you like the depth of field, it is very easy to experiment with aperture, but you still need to understand the exposure triangle so you can adjust your ISO and shutter to match the exposure in the scene. If you like the movement or lack of movement, check out my video on creative use of shutter speed, also linked in the description below. Understanding how your shutter affects your photo will help you choose the correct shutter speed, but again, you need to understand the exposure triangle to adjust the aperture and ISO to match the exposure in the scene. So although initially it might make sense that knowing someone's settings might help you learn photography, the reality is that it can do more harm than good. If you try using another photographer's settings without understanding why those settings were used and you end up with a completely different looking image to what you were expecting, it can lead to frustration and in some cases giving up on photography altogether. The only time it is helpful to know what settings someone is using is when you're on a shoot with them, like a photography workshop, and you have the opportunity to take the photo right there and then straight after they have taken the shot. Only then will you get an image that looks almost identical to their photo. But if you have found a photo online and you want to replicate the look, don't use the settings posted unless you have an understanding of how these settings produce the image so you can adapt to your situation. As always, thanks for watching. please comment below with any questions. And if you have found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and press the bell icon so you don't miss out on future videos.